Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome to the channel. I hope that you will like what you see and subscribe below for more. In today's video, we are going to be sewing. We're going to be sewing along to an older pattern. The pattern is McCall's 8313, and I'm going to be sewing along with view D on the pattern. This pattern is still available on simplicity.com. I double checked today. I thought it was only available in PDF, but I see that it is available in pattern, in the paper pattern. So if you're interested, you can still find it on simplicity.com. Like I said, we're going to be following along with view D on this pattern. For size reference, I cut the extra large and I did not make any adjustments to it. And for fabric, I used a rayon from the Sewing Studio. I'll be sure to link the shop below if you're interested. One thing that I did do was I added pockets to this pattern. This pattern did not have any pockets and needed a pocket. So I took the pattern piece out of Simplicity 9756. I had this pattern close by. So I just grabbed this pattern piece out of it. Let me give you a close look of what that looks like. So if you have a similar pattern, then you can cut that out. And when I start to install mine, you probably can't see it, but when I install my pattern piece, you'll be seeing me install this pattern shape, but you can use any pattern piece that you have. Another thing that I did want to mention before we started sewing is I almost trashed this whole project. There is a pattern piece number 3, the extension piece, and I had the hardest time getting this piece to install nice and clean onto the bodice. So what I ended up doing was there is a large circle on this extension piece. I actually cut mine right at that large circle because what happens is we are sewing to the large circle, back stitching, moving everything over, starting at the circle and continuing the stitch. What was happening was the extension was getting caught some kind of weird way for me. I think it was user error because other people have made this jumpsuit and they didn't say anything about, having an issue. So if you're like me and you have an issue, I hope this video will be helpful. But if you're able to sew it without, needing to shorten it, then that's great too. This would just be another option for you because like I said, for me, I had trouble, but yeah, I'm really excited for this video. I hope that it would be helpful for you. So let's go ahead and get started.
Before we begin, I do want to share me cutting out the pattern. I like that using a rotary cutter as well as self-healing cutting mats, and I am cutting out the size extra large in this jumpsuit. As you can see, I am pressing my patterns, and when I cut out my fabric, I cut using another rotary cutter that I use for cutting fabric, cutting out my interfacing, and I'm going to fuse everything and transfer my markings.
The first thing that you want to do is go ahead and grab pattern piece number 1. This is the bodice front. You should have transferred all of your circles here on the pattern. To begin, we're going to gather up down here between the 2 small circles on the bodice. So again, if you did not transfer your dots, make sure that you go back and transfer. For gathers, you want to do 2 rows of basting stitches right here between the dots. If you don't know how to gather, you want to increase your stitch length up to the highest it can go. The longest my stitch goes up to is a 5.0, but yours may be different, so definitely refer to your machine manual on how to increase your stitch length. Take it up to the highest that it can go, and let's go ahead and do some gathering stitches now. Okay, I have 2 rows of gathering stitches stitched on here. Again, I just stitched them right between the markings. I did it for both of the fronts. And so now with right sides facing, we are going to lay our front pieces together. I did go ahead and finish off the front edge with my serger. You can see I have a clean finish here along the front. And so now you should have transferred a large dot along the center front. We're going to stitch right below this large dot. So I've placed a pin here right at my large dot. I'll place another. We can go to the sewing machine and you want to stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end. Let's go ahead and stitch it in place now, again at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, after you have stitched again from that large dot down to the bottom, now you can go ahead and give your seam a press. I've pressed mine open here. Now we can go ahead and put the front to the side and start to work on the back. To begin working on the back, we're going to do the same thing that we did for the front. First, we need to gather between these small dots along the lower edge of the bodice. So again, if you did not transfer your markings, go back and transfer. And then we can go to the sewing machine, put our machine back on a basting stitch, and now we can go ahead and do 2 rows of gathers between these 2 small circles. After you have your gathering stitches on the lower edge of the bodice, again between both of those small dots, now we can go ahead and put our back pattern pieces right sides facing. As you can see, I did go ahead and finish off my seams with my serger. And so with right sides facing, we are going to pin here along the center back You should have transferred a notch as well as some markings. We're going to pin there. After you have the center back pinned, now we can go ahead and stitch it in place. You want to begin stitching down here at the bottom. We're going to stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You want to back stitch at the beginning, and you want to stop sewing at your large dots. Let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Okay, now that I have my center back seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and give this a press. Now that we have the center back seam sewn, I've gone ahead and pressed my seam open. The next thing for us to do is to go ahead and grab our front piece. We're going to put it right sides facing with the back bodice. We're going to stitch at our shoulder seams, and then we're also going to stitch our side and underarm seam here. Before I grab the front piece, I'm just going to go ahead and serge my raw edges. That way, once everything is sewn, I'll be able to press everything flat. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, I have finished off my shoulder edges as well as the side edges with my serger. So now with right sides facing, I am going to grab some pins and pin it all in place. Okay, now that we have the shoulders as well as the sides pinned for our underarm seam, after we have it stitched at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you want to go back over that same stitch right here kind of in the curve. That's just going to help to reinforce that area. Let's go ahead and do it now. Okay, I have my shoulder seams and side seams sewn. I'm going to go ahead and press them open. Okay, after you have your shoulder seams sewn as well as the side seam sewn and you've gone ahead and pressed them open, next we can go ahead and hem our sleeve. Our sleeve hem is going to be a narrow hem. So to do that, we're going to do a 5/8 of an inch narrow hem. You can go ahead and press up 5/8 of an inch and give that a press all the way around. After it's pressed, you can open it out, fold in the raw edge to that crease, and then fold it back over. Let's do that now. So now I can go to the sewing machine and go ahead and stitch my hems in place. Okay, I have my sleeve hems sewn. This is what it looks like along the inside. And this is what it looks like on the outside. So now we can go ahead and put the bodice to the side and move on to the next step. The next step is to work on our extension pattern piece number 3. You should have cut out 1. With right sides together, we are going to fold this in half along the fold line, and we are going to stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance along the short ends. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now that you have the ends of the extension sewn, let's go ahead and trim. Now we can flip it toward the inside and give everything a press. After you have it pressed, you can baste the raw edges here together. Okay, I've just basted right here at a 5/8 of an inch along the raw edges to keep them together. So now let's go ahead and put this onto the bodice. And we're going to be placing this onto the left front bodice. So make sure that you are not putting it on the right, but have it on the left. And with right sides facing, let's go ahead and match up our notches as well as the other circles that's on the extension. And as you can see, your extension, it should be coming past the seam, coming down onto that seam that we've already stitched. So this is the extension here. This is where we stitched that. It should be able to come past this so that the notches match up. Match up that large circle, and again, continue pinning. Okay, now that we have it pinned, we can go ahead and baste it in place, and you can baste right along the same basting stitch that you just put on the extension. So let's go ahead and baste it in place now. Now that we have the extension basted onto the left, I'm just going to go ahead and put this to the side, and now we can start to work on the facing pieces. For our interfacing pieces, you should have already fused your interfacing to them as well as transferred your markings. I'm going to start on number 4, the front facing first, and with right sides facing, we are going to stitch the facing pieces together starting from this large dot going down to the bottom. So again, you want to start here at this bottom circle and then stitch going down to the end. I'm going to place a pin here at this large circle. Since we need to stitch our center back as well, we can go ahead and pin. So while we're at the machine, we can do that stitch also. So we are going to be stitching along the center back here of the back facing. You should have transferred a circle there. So again, with the right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and pin. So for this piece here, we're going to start stitching at this dot and stitch down to the end. We want to leave it open right here. It's not a lot, but we do not want to stitch all the way to the end. So start stitching at the large dot and then stitch down to the end of your back facing. And on your front facing piece, we are stitching at this dot and stitching down to the end of the front facing. Let's go ahead and do both of our stitches now on our facing pieces. Okay, now that we have our back and our front facing sewn from the large circles down, now we can go ahead and put our shoulder seams right sides together. And we can pin those in place, match up your notches. Now that you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch it in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After we have it stitched, you can go ahead and press your seams open. I'm going to press my seams on my center back and the front facing seam as well. And then you want to finish off the outer edges of your facing. So these curved edges here, we want to finish those off. I'll finish mine off with my serger. You can finish your edges off with whatever method you prefer. So again, after you have the shoulder seam sewn, go ahead and press the seams open flat and then finish off the outer edges of your facing. Okay, now that we have our facing pieces sewn at the shoulders, I've pressed mine open here. I finished off the outer edges of the facing with my serger. Now let's go ahead and pin this on to the bodice. So with right sides facing, I'm going to first pin at my shoulder seams, making sure I have the front facing down here at the front. You want to pin at your shoulder seams as well as at your notches and markings. Now that you have your facing pinned onto your bodice, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to go ahead and stitch it on in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you make it down to the large circles that are here on the end of the facing, you want to back stitch and cut your thread here. So don't continue stitching and try to stitch across and come back up. You need to back stitch on this side of the dot, cut your thread after you back stitch, and then you want to move the seam allowance over so that you can see the other dot on this side, back stitch and start back stitching on this side. So again, once you get down here, don't just stitch across and come up. You want to back stitch, cut your thread, and then move your seam allowance over, start back at your circle, and then continue stitching all the way around. You do the same thing for your back as well. Once you get to that circle, which my circle's kind of disappeared because I ironed it, but once you get to the circle that you transferred, back stitch, cut your thread, move your seam allowances over, start back at that circle, and then continue stitching. Let's go ahead and do that all now.
Okay, so here's a look at my extension, and as you can see, it is not laying nice and flat. After I attached the facing pieces to it, something weird started to happen with the facing. I actually had stitched it onto the other side by accident, so I had to unpick it. I tried to play around with it again, but it still was just not laying flat. As you can see, it's a lot of bunching right there that's happening toward the end, and I did not like that. So I decided to go ahead and just unpick the stitch. I wanted to play around with the extension a little bit. I decided I want to shorten it right at that large dot. I felt like the excess fabric that was below the dot was causing the issue for me. So again, I decided to unpick the basting stitch at the extension. I wanted to flip it right sides together and just stitch right at the large dot. So that's what I did. After stitching it, I went ahead and trimmed off that excess fabric. Again, this is all on extension pattern piece number 3. I poked out my corners and then I went ahead and pinned everything back in place. Again, this extension is now stopping right at the large dot. It's not going past the large dot. And so after I had it pinned, I went ahead and did my stitch again to see how it would look. Okay, after I stitched it in, I turned everything right side out to see how I liked it, and I was very pleased with how the extension looked after I shortened it. For me, I just had a difficult time getting it in nice and smooth for some reason, but after I shortened it, everything was going to be laying nice and flat once I finished with the construction of it, and this is what the inside of it looked like. It was just a little bit shorter, but still very nice and clean.
Now that we have our extension on, let's go ahead and trim down our seam. After we have it trimmed, then we can do understitching. With understitching, you want to make sure that you have your seam allowance going toward the facing, and then we're just going to stitch really close to the seam as far as we could go. So first, let's go ahead and trim, and then we can do our understitching right along the neck edge. Okay, now that you have done your understitching all the way along your facing as far as you could go, you do want to tack down your facing here. I've tacked mine down here along my shoulders as well as the back and the front. And all I did was I just did a couple stitches back and forth right in this seam. You can't really see it on the outside of the garment. You can do this by hand too if you prefer. But again, just make sure that you tack down your facing toward the inside. That way it's not rolling out while you're wearing your garment. After you have given everything a good press, now let's go ahead and put this to the side and we can start to work on the pants. To get started, I'm going to start working on pattern piece number 6, which is our front. I am actually going to be installing pockets. This pattern does not come with pockets, but this is the type of pocket here, the shape that I am going to be installing in these pants. If you have a pattern that has this type of pocket shape, you can just copy that pattern piece. But I'm going to go ahead and install these pockets and then we can continue on with constructing, following along with the instructions. I finished off the edge of the pocket with my serger. There is a notch here on the side of the pant. I am just going to match up the notch from the pocket with that notch there. And I'm going to pin it in place. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side seam here on my front, matching it up at the notch and just pinning it in place. Now that we have the pockets pinned on, I pinned them on here. Now we're going to pin the remaining pockets onto the back side seam the same exact way, matching up that notch. After you have them pinned on, we're going to stitch right down the pocket using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, I have sewn the pockets onto my fronts and to my backs. Here is one of my backs here, and as you can see, I have the pocket sewn on. So now I'm going to take a front and place it right sides facing to the back, and then we can go ahead and stitch around the pocket in the remainder of our side seam, and then we can stitch the inner leg seam. But first I'm going to go ahead and place it right sides together. I'm not going to press just yet, only because I have my markings here on my pattern and I don't want them to disappear. But you can definitely press your pocket going out towards your seam like so that it's nice and flat. I'm going to go ahead and grab my front here. Place that right sides together like so. And I'm going to pin right here at the first marking. And again, hopefully the pattern that you are using has marks on it. Those marks is where we're going to stop and start back sewing at, so we can have an opening here for our hand. And the pattern piece that I am using is Simplicity 9756. Once you have pinned at the markings, you can add some more pins. Once you have it pinned, we can go to the sewing machine. We're going to begin stitching up here at the top and stitch down to our first marking. We're going to back stitch there and cut our threads. Start back stitching at the second marking and then continue stitching all the way down the pant leg. And then we can come back and stitch around the pocket. Let's go ahead and do our stitching now. And then again, you want to do the same thing to the other front and back. Okay, now that we have our pocket sewn on, I'm just going to open it up so we can have a look at it. This is what the pocket will look like here. So now we can go to the sewing machine, and with right sides facing, we can go ahead and sew our inner leg seam together. So you want to go ahead and grab your pins and stitch this together. We're going to be sewing at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you have it sewn, you can press your seams open flat. I'm going to press my side seams open as well. So now let's go ahead and sew the inner leg seams on both of our pant legs together. Okay, I have my inner leg seam sewn and I pressed my seams open flat. And so now I'm going to take one of my pants legs here, the ones that's turned right side out, and I'm going to put it into the pant leg that's turned wrong side out. So make sure that you have right sides facing while you're putting your pants in. So I'm just going to again put them in so that they're right sides facing. I'm just putting one pant leg into the other. I'm going to pin down here at the center seam and match that up. I'm going to match up my notches. Now we're going to go ahead and go to the sewing machine, and we are going to stitch our center seam here, our crotch seam closed. We're going to stitch it a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After we have that stitched, then we're going to stitch in between the notches at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance right here along the curve. That's just going to help to add a little bit more stability and reinforce this center seam here. Let's go ahead and do our stitching now. Okay, now that we have our pants sewn, I'm going to go ahead and pull my other leg out here. I'm going to flip it right sides out. Okay, I'm going to go to my pressing station. I'm just going to press my seams open, and then I'm going to trim away my loose threads, and we can move on to the next step. Okay, I've pressed my seams open, and now let's go ahead and grab our bodice. And we are going to pin the bodice right sides facing. We will need to pull up on these gathers that we made at the beginning along the lower edge of the bodice so that everything will fit. But I'm just going to go ahead and place this right sides facing. First, let me find my front. Okay, this is my front here. All right, so I have my bodice right sides facing to the pant. I'm just going to start matching up my seams, my center seams, and my side seams, as well as the center back seams, and I'm going to start pinning them in place. Okay, I'm going to start pulling up on my gathering stitches to get everything to fit. I'm going to match up my notch here as well and pin in place. Okay, now that we have it pinned, we're going to stitch in a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance. So again, make sure that you adjust your gather so that everything fits, match up your notches and your seams, and let's stitch in a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you have it stitched, you want to press your seam going down toward your pants, and I'm actually just going to finish off the edge of my seam. I'm not going to trim anything away because we need it to create a casing for the elastic, so I'm not going to trim anything away. I just need to finish my seam because once we press it down, we're just going to be stitching it closed, and I don't want to have raw edges like this. So again, after I stitch at a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance here, I'm just going to finish off the raw edge with my serger and then press everything down so that we can create the casing by stitching the edge. Let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Okay, now that we have sewn along the waist seam, again, we stitched at a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I went ahead and just finished off the edge with my serger, and I pressed it going down toward the pant. So now we're going to stitch to create a casing a 1/4 of an inch away from this edge here. And we want to make sure that we leave an opening so that we can insert our elastic. So you can pick any place that you want to start. I'm just going to put a pin here where I can finish the seam, and this pin here where I will start my stitch. So I will start here, stitch all the way around, come back here, and then back stitch, leaving this opening to insert the elastic. So let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. You can definitely pin yours in place if your fabric isn't pressing well. My fabric is pressing pretty good, so I'm just going to go ahead and stitch a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge now. Okay, I've gone ahead and stitched my casing. So this is what that looks like along the right side here. This is the opening that I left, and so I'm going to get my elastic and start to feed it through. I'm going to take my elastic here, and I cut this according to the elastic guide, which is pattern piece number 9. I'm going to put a safety pin on one end, and I'm just going to start to feed it through the opening that I left. This is going to be kind of tricky because there are a lot of seams here, so I'm already stuck right there. So I'm going to have to kind of wiggle this around to try to get past that. Just continue feeding your elastic through your casing. Okay, now that you have pulled your elastic all the way through the casing, you can go ahead and try on your jumpsuit to make sure you don't need to trim any away. Go ahead and do that now before you secure it. But once you're happy with your elastic, you want to go ahead and secure it in place. First, make sure it's not twisted. Mine's is kind of twisted. Okay, I think that's good there. You want to lap it like so. Don't put it like this to sew it. Make sure that you lap it over. And we can go ahead and stitch back and forth. If you want, you can make a little box to secure it, but let's just go to the sewing machine and go ahead and stitch our elastic closed now. After we have it stitched, then we can close up the opening that we left here in the casing. Okay, this is what it looks like after we have installed our elastic. We have our casing here. This is the outside, and this is what mine looks like on the inside. I need to trim away some threads. So this is what it looks like along the inside here. Next, we can move on to doing our hem. For our hem, we are doing a 5/8 of an inch narrow hem. So what you can do is press up 5/8 of an inch. Once you have that pressed, open it out. You want to fold in the raw edge and then fold back up on that first press. Let's go ahead and finish our hem now, and then we can move on to the final steps. Okay, I have my hem done here. I'm going to give this one final press, and then we can move on to the final steps of closing up along the extension.
We're going to be adding thread loops as well as hooks along the extensions to close it up. I'm opting to do a thread chain loop, but there are other ways that you can do this. I actually have a video on simplicity right now, and I will link it below, that gives you 4 different options, 2 by hand and 2 by sewing machine, that will allow you to create a thread chain loop. And once you get this motion down, you start to create little knots that just get longer and longer. As you can see, this one is getting longer the more I do the technique. And once I'm happy with the length of that, I'm just going to go ahead and tie off the thread. Once it's tied, then I'm going to add my hook onto the right opening edge like so. And then once it's all done, this is how it looks. I did go back and add the top stitching around the neckline in the front, and this is the final look, and I really am happy with the way that it turned out.
Well, that is all for the video, and I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, you can leave them down for me below. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn on your notifications so you know when the next video goes live, and I will see you all then. Blessings, everyone. Bye.